Today I want to look at one passage. I want to look at one passage found in Deuteronomy where Moses is instructing the Israelites in the law of God. So it's just before they are about to enter the promised land, a second generation of Israelites, and before Moses' death. So sometimes Deuteronomy is called the second saying or the second pronouncing of the law. This passage is found in Deuteronomy 16. I'm going to go over there to Deuteronomy 16. And the verses concerning the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost as we know it, are found in Deuteronomy 16, 19 through 12. This is where Moses is giving specific instructions on how to keep the day of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, as it was known, as I said, at their time. The passage I want to look at is found at the very end of the specific instructions. I know Mr. Black, he mentioned one of those instructions, which is to bring a free will offering. Another one of those instructions is what all were supposed to be there, all were to attend. So some of these specific instructions that Moses was giving them at this time. But I want to narrow in on verse 12. So he's given these particular instructions, and now he makes a statement at the end of these instructions, and it's found in verse 12 of Deuteronomy 16. And he says this curious thing. Well, I find it curious anyway. He says this, "And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt." You were a slave in Egypt. This instruction given by Moses to the Israelites here to remember that they were slaves in Egypt can be found in multiple places. So you can find this statement, remember that you were a slave in Egypt, in multiple places, especially in Deuteronomy. It is also found in Exodus. It's found in multiple places. In this case, as I said, it's made in conjunction with the feast or the day of Pentecost. The intent or the meaning behind this instruction by Moses to the Israelites was to keep that fact that they were slaves in Egypt, fixed in their minds. So he was saying, fix this in your mind. Remember this. Don't forget this. This is something that I want you to hold on to. Moses here was telling them not to forget. He's telling them not to forget. You know, I think I've been out in the church, baptized in the church over 40 years. And I can remember, and I know everybody's going, if I say who's got 50, who's got 60, who's got 70, you know, and then we always end up with Mrs. Trabig. But yeah, a lot of people. And Mrs. Trabig's not that old, because we can bring out Methuselah. I'm sorry, Mrs. Trabig. But anyway, when you look back, you can say, you know what, we can all remember that journey and how we got here. Specifics. The bathtub that I got baptism was kind of dirty. You know, it was shallow. The minister was driving me down and trying to push every part of me under the water. Sure, there were some comical things that you can think back on, but what really was fixed in my mind is, and what Moses is trying to have us fix in our mind is, what happened there? And in this case, 40 years earlier, what happened there that Moses wanted to have them fixed in their minds? Let's go over here to Deuteronomy 5. I said one passage with appendages. So I'm going to go to a couple more passages. Deuteronomy 5, verses 15. And this kind of gets at what Moses is trying to get them to remember. Let me get over there. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 15. And he's actually talking about the law here. So once again, we see Pentecost, the specific instructions. Moses is re-giving the law, and then he says this statement in verse 15. "And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from here by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm." This is what God did, and that's what God wanted them to remember, because if they remembered that, they remember what God did. If you remember what happened at that time, then they would also remember what was said at that time. And I think that is just a really important thing, that he's trying to get them to fix this in his mind, because the whole situation is going to change for them shortly. They're going to move into the promised land. So he wants them to fix, how did you get here? How did you get here? You got here through the mighty hand of God. He did it. He redeemed them. He brought them out. Israel, despite having the very presence of God with them at Mount Sinai in Exodus 20. I wrote this down, and it's funny, like I said, you know, going after Mr. Waddle, he's going to take everything, and the good thing is Mr. Savidia is going to be left with trinkets. He's going to have little things. Anyway, but when you look at it and you go, if you say Israel's history could be tapped up in a statement, it could be said like this: All the Lord has spoken, we will do. That's what they said when they kept the old covenant. But by Judges, what did they say? Every man did what was right in their own sight. So we started out with a hiss and a roar, if you will. We're going to do this. We're going to commit to what God has given us to do. And over here, we're going to we're just going to do what we want to do. And that's what Moses is saying. Remember that who you're dealing with is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's God. And God did this. He's the one that liberated you. And if you go further through that passage, you'll see that their time, their life would change. And then those things they would start to say in their mind, hey, we're pretty good here. We did this, we did that. And forgetting that, God is the one that redeemed them. Why did a whole generation of Israelites, those who were 20 years of older, the parents, the grandparents of this generation, because all of those individuals had to be under the age of 20 that were going to enter the land, why did they die in the wilderness? Why did they die? Because they didn't follow God. And you go, okay, I get that. But here's the kicker. Absolutely. You have to obey God, not just in what you want to, but in everything He says, and you have to do it absolutely, or all of it. They died because they forgot God by not keeping His commandments. So it's kind of like the old saying goes, I love my God, but you go, how? How do you love your God? One of the only ways that we're given to love God and worship God is through keeping His commandments. And that's the important thing here. God is saying to them, don't forget that I redeemed you, and prove to me that you haven't forgotten by what you do. Let's go over here to Deuteronomy 8. I suppose when I said one, I meant one in the sense I'm not going to leave Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 8. And I have to apologize to Mrs. Video. I don't think he just gives trinkets. He gives great stuff. So before I get off the stage and I get corrected, I'm going to put that in there so that I save myself from further punishment. But anyway, verse 11 of Deuteronomy 8. And this proves what I'm trying to say. So this is not what I just came up with. This is how God says, remember me. This is how to have your mind fixed on me. Prove it by doing these things. And He said this in verse 11. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments. That's how you say, I remember the God at my baptism. The same as I said from way back in time. I remember that I have not forgotten Him by what I'm doing today. I went to Subway for lunch, and this guy said to me today, he said, he had a cowboy hat on, looked like a Texan. I looked like a New Zealander. He sees the time. He said to me, "What? You working today?" I said, "Not really. I'm at church." And he said, "Well, what church?" He said, "Church of God." Well, he said, "You're working. You're working, all right. You're at Church of God." And then he asked me another question. I'm thinking, man, is this going to turn into a proselytizing exercise? But anyway, he goes, I'm a good Baptist, and I'm like, okay, I'm trying to think, okay, put my Baptist cap on, and, I just basically said, we're part of a Sabbath-keeping church. And then the problem was he's thinking we keep the Sabbath on Sunday. So I did not save that individual. I did not save him. I tried. Leave it to Mr. Kylo. He can get it done. And of course, only by God's Spirit. But look at that verse once again. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments. And like I said, so many people think, I fear God. I have awe of God. And I say that and ask the question, show me how, as a Missourian would say. Show me how. And the how is by keeping the commandments of God. And then let's go back to where we started. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 16. Deuteronomy 16, if I can find it. And as I said, not only were they to keep in mind, or having fixed in their mind that they were to keep the law of God, go back to what I said in verse 12 of 16, and it says this, and you shall be, so you say, I'm keeping the commandments, I'm keeping the commandments, I'm a generalizer, I'm trying to do good, but it says to keep or choose or keep them carefully, observe them all, keep them carefully. Don't just say like, God's going to give me some grace here, God's going to give me some. No, He's saying keep my law and keep it carefully. And as we know, the Israelites thought, hey, God can live with this, God can live with that. God's saying, no, it's one way, and that way is to keep these commandments that God has given them carefully. Why is this generation, why was this generation's journey out of slavery important to us at the day of Pentecost, 3,400 years or so later? Why is it important to us? Because their journey is a type. It's a type. If you take away what we heard this morning from Mr. Herrick and what you talk from Mr. Waddle, you say, we are on a journey. We have been coming out. If you go with the holy day calendar, you go like it's only 40 or 50 days since, well, it's 50 days exactly since we left liberation through Jesus Christ at Passover. But now, how do we live? How do we go forward? And that's why their story is so important to us. Why 1 Corinthians 10 points to they are examples for us. And you say, I have God's Holy Spirit. But why did Paul give that to people that had God's Holy Spirit? Because they could fall away. They could go back into their ways. And like I said, the journey of what Israel went through is so helpful, and it points to the journey that we're on. Yes, they were taken out of slavery. Yes, we were taken out of slavery. Yes, they were physically redeemed. Yes, we are spiritually redeemed. We were redeemed, they were redeemed, I should say, to have the promised land. God was going to give them that land because He promised. It showed, once again, God's consistency to do what He said He was going to do. But God has also promised us today, those that sit here, that He has redeemed us to be first fruits. First fruits to live in God's, and I love this. I wrote this down, not that I love it because I wrote it, but I look at it and I go, it's truly beautiful. We have been called to be first fruits, to live in God's presence, the presence of God and the presence of the Lamb. It's just beautiful. Why are these words of Moses given to us by God so important to us today? They show us that we must keep our minds fixed, or remembered, if you will, on God, our Redeemer, the one that freed us. He freed us. He is the wave sheaf. He began it all. I mean, it's funny, like I said, you say you want to be a Christian, then you have to look like Him. And how do you look like Him? You look like Him as you behave like Him. And what did He do? He kept every commandment of His Father. And so what He's trickling down to us is, be like me. Be a first fruit. Think like I think. And then, once we've been freed, how are we supposed to live? We're supposed to live by remembering to observe the commandments carefully. Carefully, I have to say that quietly. Carefully. Watch what you're doing, how you're behaving. Why are these words, like I said, so important to us? Because as we saw, these laws were aligned on Pentecost to what God had given them to do. He told them, this is part of my plan, this is part of my law, and so remember who you're dealing with and to keep those laws carefully. This feast day, to me, is interesting, and as Mr. Waddle, so I can quote him, Mr. Waddle said that maybe the law was given on this day. It does make sense. It makes sense that the law was given on this day. But if it's not, we know the law has still been given. The date is not as important, but the law was given. But Israel never had the capacity to keep the law because of human nature. They tried to do it, but as we saw and we proved earlier, they trickled down into the wrong behavior. They went the wrong way. What we do know about this day, the day of Pentecost, is God has given us the gift of His Spirit. Everybody remembers that on the day. It's kind of unusual because, I'm not the most tactile person on the earth. But I remember the minister, after baptizing me and asking me if I'd repented of my sins, then he laid hands on me so that I could have that gift, which gives us the ability to think and behave in a new way, which is to live and by and through His Spirit, so that we can look at the law that points to Jesus Christ and how He lives, that we can live by those things, and so that then we can become first fruits. What's the key for first fruits? It's to have our minds fixed on God in a world that's gone crazy. That's what we have to do. We can't forget. Some people say, I'm not a historian. Everybody in the church has to be a historian when it comes to these facts. Remember that what God has done in our lives and hold fast to that and never forget it. And on top of that, it gives us the ability to live by His every word and His law. That's the power of God's Spirit. None of us have that. As we look at this day, like I wrote in my notes, I look at it and I go, what a day. What a day. I get to speak on this day almost every year. And every year I come back and I go, what a day. A day that we can rejoice before the God of heaven.